Hello, my name is Chuck Eesley, and today I wanted to talk to you a bit about institutions and entrepreneurship using data from China, Japan, and the US. And I want to talk about three main themes: experimentation, calculated risk, and failure. And in particular, I think using this kind of international data, what I'm interested in is using it to better understand at a theoretical level what's the relationship between institutions, policies, and entrepreneurship. So rather than just looking at empirical differences statistically across countries, I think what we really want to do is use the particular institutional settings and policy changes in different countries to inform us at a more theoretical level about how the broader institutional environment shapes entrepreneurial firm performance and entrepreneurship behavior. So I think while high-tech entrepreneurship might have originated in Boston or Silicon Valley in the US, it's now spread around the globe. And the way I see it, we're all now in a race to better understand how to foster and encourage high-tech entrepreneurship, because the regions that figure this out will have an advantage in terms of economic growth and improved quality of life. And just for fun, we see President Obama here meeting with a lot of Silicon Valley leaders, sampling on the dependent variable, and asking those who have been successful as entrepreneurs and VCs what policies and what programs might encourage entrepreneurship. But what I've tried to do is, rather than sampling on the dependent variable, generate some data to try and shed light on these issues. And so this starts with an alumni survey of all MIT alumni, where we got 43,000 responses. We then identified those who had been entrepreneurs and sent them a follow-up survey to learn more about their entrepreneurial attempts and gather much more detailed data about their ventures, both successful and unsuccessful. And subsequently, we used this, myself and my co-authors and students have used this MIT alumni survey as a template to then gather data internationally. And so I've done a similar alumni survey with Tsinghua University in China, located in Beijing. And we asked some unique questions, but largely kept the bulk of the survey the same so that we can have some overlapping data in the Chinese context and US context as well. And this survey has now been taken and replicated with Stanford University, University of Virginia, and also internationally now we're working on surveying University of Tokyo graduates in Japan, Technion graduates in Israel, as well as several other locations. These are the entrepreneurial respondents from the Chinese survey, and there's a large cluster in Beijing and Shanghai, but also some geographic dispersion across the country as well. So the first topic I want to talk about is experimentation. And the way I see it, these entrepreneurial ventures, not only are they perhaps commercializing some scientific or engineering breakthroughs, but the startup itself is also an experiment in the economy and an experiment in a new type of business model. And so the way I see it, institutions and policies are going to support entrepreneurship to the extent that they support this kind of experimentation. And so I'm going to give a few examples and just kind of keep it at a fairly high level to spur discussion and try not to get bogged down into the details too much. So the first paper is on science parks. And this paper is with a great doctoral student, Daniel Armanios, and basically looks at the role of science parks in the Chinese context in an emerging economy. And so the literature in the West had tended to say, well, science parks don't really work, and the ventures aren't really that much higher performing than non-science park firms. It turns out this isn't true in the Chinese context. In an emerging economy, science park can actually help ventures to become more innovative and to grow faster. And particularly, they help those entrepreneurs who lack government ties. The second paper is on changes in entrepreneurial strategy. And it turns out in the Chinese context, as we get transition from more of a planned economy to more a market-oriented economy, you see changes in what strategies lead to higher performance amongst entrepreneurial firms. And these changes shift from kind of relationship strategies, having a tie with a government official, to being located in a science park, to competition in the market in the form of having had entrepreneurial experience or choosing more of an innovation strategy. The types of strategies that lead to higher performance shift with the development of the institutional environment. The second topic I want to talk about is what supports calculated risk-taking. In particular, we might want to encourage the best and the brightest to become entrepreneurs, as those who are more likely to create high-impact, more high-tech, successful companies. And so I used the China data to look at two different types of institutional reforms. One that lowers barriers to entry, and the second type that lowers barriers to growth. And I find it's this lowering the barriers to growth of existing entrepreneurial firms that tends to tempt in more high quality, high human capital individuals to become entrepreneurs. And so the factors of who becomes an entrepreneur and who doesn't aren't pre-existing laws of nature, but are determined by the type of institutional environment. And this reform lowered the barriers to growth, and we see that firms indeed grew larger, and this resulted in more high human capital individuals choosing to become entrepreneurs. The next study that I think is interesting uses tries to again look at how can we encourage more of the students to become entrepreneurs, and part of it might be the educational training they receive. And so there was an interesting reform at Tsinghua University where they changed the curriculum to be more flexible. They allowed students to have more choice in what courses they could take, mix and match from across majors and departments, have more flexibility to pursue their interests and pursue ideas at the borderline of academic fields. And this wound up having the effect of increasing entrepreneurship amongst the alumni, particularly those who were getting lower GPAs. And then the other study, in terms of calculated risk-taking, uses the Chinese context and the China's Project 985 as a natural experiment. 985 gave a large amount of additional research funding to a certain set of universities. And so looking at students who attended those universities versus similar students who attended other universities, this influx of additional research funding to the university encouraged more people to become high-tech entrepreneurs, but those people tended to have lower performance. And so we get this insight out of this that encouraging high-tech entrepreneurship is not just about more money for university R&D, but might require other changes in the environment to make more high-tech firms successful, such as training for entrepreneurs or reducing the influence of state-owned enterprises. And finally, I wanted to talk briefly about failure, and if this is what happens when you fail, then this is going to tend to discourage calculated risk-taking. So we use data from Japan, and this is a great doctoral student I've been working with, Robert Eberhardt, and we look at bankruptcy reform in Japan, and we label this lowering the barriers to failure. So when you make it less painful, easier to go through bankruptcy, then you tend to bring in more high-quality entrepreneurs, and these more high-quality entrepreneurs tend to have higher growth rates in their firms. And then this is more about fields rather than geographic or country differences, but I've also got this paper using the MIT alumni data where we show that the optimal founding team composition depends on the type of industry. So if you're in an industry where entrepreneurial firms tend to cooperate with industry incumbents, such as biotech, medical devices, then having an all-engineer team can be more helpful. But if you're in an industry where entrepreneurial firms tend to compete in the product market against industry incumbents, then having a more functionally diverse founding team tends to be better. So the team composition is shaped by the industry environment. And then finally, I wanted to give some data offering some comparisons across these different geographies and data sets in terms of economic impact. And I think one of the big takeaways from doing these alumni surveys is that the university has a huge economic impact through its students and alumni. At MIT, this was 25,000 active companies created, 3.3 million jobs created, almost $2 trillion in worldwide annual revenues created. Amongst the Stanford alumni, this is over 30,000 active companies, 5.4 million jobs created, and almost 2.7 trillion in annual world revenues. So this economic impact of the students and alumni is an order of magnitude larger than that created by faculty spinoffs, which is what most of the research literature in this area tends to focus on. And so showing some data from the Stanford alumni survey, we see the percentage of alumni who said that the technology licensing office played some role in their startup is fairly low, but the number who said that taking an entrepreneurship course or interacting with the alumni network played an important role in creating their venture is significantly higher. And so the university's entrepreneurial impact is not just from licensing technology. And finally, with some of the comparisons between the MIT and Tsinghua dataset are interesting, but haven't yet formulated an entire paper around them. But just to throw out a few things as a provocative comparison, first of all, we see that the industries that these alumni are going into are fairly similar, although the types of opportunities that they're pursuing within those industries is probably a bit different. And the Tsinghua alumni entrepreneurs also have a large economic impact, although not quite as large in terms of revenues as the MIT alumni or Stanford alumni. The primary source of the ideas for their startups is slightly different. The Chinese alumni tend to be less likely to get their ideas from working in industry and more likely to get their ideas socially in formal discussions with other students or visiting scientists and engineers. The distribution of firms by size shows that in terms of employees, the MIT firms are a little bit larger, but still roughly similar. But the big difference comes when you look at the revenues. The MIT firms are significantly larger even after you've corrected for the exchange rate and purchasing power parity. And in terms of initial capital, the Chinese firms are much lower in initial capital relative to the MIT US firms. And one cautionary note in terms of looking at patent data internationally, you see on the right-hand column the Tsinghua alumni. Large majorities say that they are the author of intellectual property, or they own some intellectual property, but the percentage who say that that intellectual property is important for the success of their venture is actually much lower. So patents may not be the best measure of innovation, particularly in these emerging economy contexts. So in conclusion, I think we can use this international, geographically dispersed data, and particularly these kind of policy reforms, to look at the roles of institutions in fostering experimentation, risk-taking, and easing the process of failure amongst entrepreneurs. And so I've been looking at the role of institutions in entrepreneurship, both in terms of formal policy institutions, but also in terms of more informal cultural mechanisms. And then in the middle, looking at some industry differences as well, which I know we're going to talk about later in the conference session. So So thank you all very much for your time and attention.